When an atheist professor decided to ridicule God in front of Karoline Leavitt, he assumed it would be a simple triumph. Instead, what unfolded was a crushing defeat for him. Before we get into the details, drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. The scene took place at one of those elite academic gatherings where the sharpest young minds in America come together, a setting where professors relish flaunting their intellectual dominance and forward-thinking ideals. Among those present was Karoline Leavitt, who had secured her spot through sheer academic merit, though whispers circulated that her presence owed more to her connections. Professor Tavern Cale had built a reputation in scholarly circles for his piercing intellect and even more biting sarcasm. A proud advocate of contemporary thought, he'd carved out a name for himself by mocking traditional principles, especially Christian faith. His lectures were less about teaching and more about theatrics, turning belief into a target and God into a punchline. As students poured into the expansive lecture hall that morning, an electric hum filled the air. Professor Cale's notoriety set the stage, and everyone knew his sessions were like intellectual showdowns. What they didn't anticipate was that this time, an unlikely victor would emerge. Cale launched into his presentation with his typical swagger, striding across the room like a hunter eyeing his next catch. His subject, shedding outdated convictions in favor of enlightened reasoning. His gaze swept the audience, pausing briefly on Karoline with a faint, smug grin tugging at his lips. He had no clue he was about to encounter the most humbling moment of his career. "Let's tackle the obvious issue here," Professor Cale announced, crossing his arms confidently. "Research repeatedly demonstrates a clear trend. The higher your intelligence, the less likely you are to buy into mystical nonsense." He shot a pointed glance at Karoline, adding, "Or, to put it plainly for anyone who might struggle with the concept, smart people don't cling to fairy tales." A few students squirmed in their seats as Cale projected a chart onto the screen. "Take a look at this downward slope. See how faith dwindles as education and IQ climb? Intriguing, right? Though I suppose certain family legacies," he cast another sharp look at Karoline, "might make it tougher for some to embrace rational progress." Near the back, Professor Thompson observed with mounting unease as Cale pushed boundaries further than usual. He'd witnessed Cale's provocations before, but this felt different, more personal. "What's genuinely astounding," Cale went on, his tone thick with self-assuredness, "is that here, among America's brightest, future innovators, policymakers, visionaries, some still hold tight to these ancient superstitions, trapped by their mental shortcomings." Karoline remained composed, her expression barely shifting, though her jaw tightened slightly. While others chuckled nervously or avoided eye contact, she locked eyes with Cale, unflinching. This only seemed to stoke his disdain. "Explain this to me," he pressed, slipping off his glasses and leaning into the podium. "How does someone in 2025 still put stock in an unseen overseer? What does it say about a mind so underdeveloped it relies on bedtime stories to make sense of reality?" His stare fixed on Karoline. Maybe one of our more well-networked attendees could shed some light. The room grew thick with anticipation. Students held their breath as Cale's veiled jab lingered, but no one, not even Cale, could foresee what happened when Karoline rose to her feet. "Professor," Karoline's voice sliced through the stillness, steady and deliberate, "I'd be glad to respond to your remarks about mental growth." A smirk crept across Cale's face. "Oh, how delightful. Ms. Leavitt thinks she can school us on intelligence," he said with a dramatic flourish. "Go ahead, dazzle us with how your deity aligns with quantum theory and AI advancements." "To begin," Karoline replied, her calm unshaken, "I find it curious that a self-proclaimed defender of open discussion would lean on scorn rather than substance." A ripple of surprise passed through the hall. "But since you raised the topic of mental maturity," she continued, as Cale's grin wavered, this wasn't the shaky retort he'd anticipated. "Please," he cut in, "save us the sermon. I've dedicated 3 decades to studying how minds develop. Are you implying you've got more insight?" "What I'm pointing out," Karoline said, her tone growing firmer, "is that your prejudice is glaring, Professor. You tout evidence as your guide, yet dismiss the countless sharp thinkers, past and present, who blend faith with logic. Think of Newton, Planck, Collins. Relics of the past, Kale sneered. What's next? Claiming God's got a political agenda. His jab at humor landed flat as Karoline held her ground. Here's what's truly striking, Professor, she said, standing taller. You deride belief while showing a zealot-like trust in your own brilliance. You've built a rigid doctrine where dissenters are automatically dim-witted. The room went quiet. Professor Thompson edged forward, noting Kale's flushed face. Kale hadn't bargained for this poised takedown of his stance. All right, Miss Leavitt, he growled. You want a real debate? Step up and prove how your archaic notions hold up under scrutiny. Let's see this intellect you're so proud of. As Karoline moved toward the front, the silence deepened. Kale stood poised for an easy win, certain he'd crushed this young idealist. Yet her steady confidence unsettled a few onlookers. You brought up quantum physics, she started, her voice clear and even. So let's dig in there. You say faith clashes with science, but quantum discoveries reveal a universe far weirder than our minds can fully grasp. Spare me, Kale snapped. Don't twist physics into some spiritual excuse. I'm not done, Karoline interjected, polite but resolute. You mentioned mental growth. Let's explore that. You insist faith marks a weak mind, yet studies link it to greater resilience, tighter communities, and improved well-being. Kale's expression tightened. This wasn't unfolding as he'd planned. Links don't prove anything. Precisely, Karoline shot back, but you didn't hesitate to suggest they did when it fit your narrative about IQ and belief. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. Thompson watched Kale's smugness erode. What's really at play here, Karoline pressed, isn't your issue with God or faith. It's your disdain for what you see as intellectual frailty. So tell me, is it more honest to admit some mysteries outstrip our knowledge, or to boast we've got it all solved? Kale's cheeks flared. That's not... When you scoff at faith, she continued, undeterred, you're not just targeting me or my convictions, you're belittling billions across time who've drawn purpose and insight from their bond with the divine, including scientists whose work you lean on. Kale's confidence splintered. He hadn't expected this eloquence, this steady unraveling of his position. Students who'd snickered earlier now watched Karoline with quiet admiration. So, Professor, her voice sharpened with purpose, what's the real sign of a stunted mind, trusting in something greater or thinking ridicule trumps reasoning? The room stilled. Kale parted his lips to reply, but for the first time he was at a loss, a preview of the reckoning ahead. Kale clutched the podium, his grip betraying his unease. You're spinning this all wrong, he faltered. Science has unraveled every mystery religion once claimed. Really? Karoline countered smoothly. Then explain consciousness, Professor, or life's origins, or why the universe's rules align so precisely for existence. Those are just holes we haven't filled yet. Exactly, she said, seizing the point. Holes exist, yet you're adamant nothing beyond the tangible could fill them. Isn't that its own leap of faith? The crowd was hooked now. Students who'd once smirked at Kale's barbs nodded as Karoline spoke. Let's cut to your core claim, she went on. You frame faith as a prop for the feeble-minded, yet you wield your title to intimidate anyone who dares differ, which betrays more insecurity. Kale's face darkened to a deep crimson. Listen, No, you listen, Karoline said, firm yet courteous. You preach free thought, but mock those bold enough to think outside your box. You crow about mental supremacy while showing narrow-mindedness. The air crackled with tension. Thompson shifted, seeing Kale's carefully crafted stature collapse. So answer this, Karoline said, her eyes unwavering. If faith signals weakness, why does it rattle you so much? Kale's jaw worked silently, no retort forthcoming. The hush was profound as Karoline readied her closing strike, one that would leave Kale regretting he'd ever picked this fight. Here's why it unsettles you, she said, her words ringing out. You know, deep down, your whole outlook hinges on a shaky paradox. Kale's hands tightened on the podium. What paradox? You swear by facts and logic, she replied, yet you assert with absolute certainty that God can't exist. Any scientist worth their salt knows you can't prove something doesn't exist. Your conviction isn't reason, it's a creed. Kale paled. Students abandoned their notes, riveted. What's more, Karoline continued, you jeer at those who find meaning in faith, yet your atheisms become your own gospel, preached with the zeal you condemn in others. You've just swapped God for your ego. Some students nodded eagerly, even a few of Kale's early supporters now absorbed by her critique. But the real giveaway, she said, locking eyes with him, is this. You say faith marks a lesser mind, yet you can't even parry a student's basic reasoning. So what's the truth, Professor? Are believers beneath you, or are you just out of your depth? Silence swallowed the room. Kale's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. His career of overawing students, with his brilliance, teetered. And here's the clincher, Karoline said, her tone steady and piercing. You call faith illogical, yet you trust that awareness sprang from lifelessness, life from nothingness, order from randomness, all without a guiding hand. So, which takes more blind trust, a purposeful design, or everything from nothing? Kale's expression screamed defeat. He'd blundered gravely by testing Karoline Leavitt's convictions. The quiet was deafening. Kale stood rigid, lips parted, groping for a comeback that wouldn't materialize. Students leaned in, awaiting his response to Karoline's razor-sharp reasoning. That's not... He stumbled, his scholarly armor cracking. His hands quivered against the podium. Here's the reality, Professor, Karoline said, respectful yet unyielding. Your scorn for faith isn't rooted in logic or proof. It's pure bias. And as you've taught, bias is the foe of real understanding. Professor Thompson stepped in then. Maybe, he said, standing, we should get back to the agenda. There's plenty left to cover. Karoline, sensing the lifeline tossed to the floundering professor, dipped her head. Thanks for letting me speak, Professor Kale, she said, heading back to her seat. Her graceful retreat threw Kale's earlier venom into stark relief. He lingered at the podium, rattled, as Karoline returned to her place. Students tracked her with fresh esteem. Kale tried to resume his talk, but his once bold voice faltered. His trembling fingers fumbled with his notes, his eyes flicking to Karoline's spot, braced for another blow. Over the next half hour, Kale struggled on, but the wound was fatal. His usual commanding presence dissolved into hesitancy. Each claim he ventured echoed his prior disgrace. Students who'd once revered him now stole glances at Karoline, their faces alight with wonder. Some jotted notes, not on the lecture, but on the clash they'd just seen. The current take on cognitive evolution, Kale's words faded as he glimpsed Karoline writing, her demeanor unshaken. He averted his gaze, his focus slipping entirely. Thompson, from the rear, watched with pity and insight. He'd cautioned Kale against his escalating assaults on students' beliefs, but Kale's hubris had deafened him. The once towering professor's hands shook as he flipped to his slides, phrases he'd trumpeted countless times now taunting him. Reason in today's world. The irony stung. A student raised a hand with a question, and Kale flinched, as if expecting another strike. The session blurred into halting remarks and awkward pauses. No one dwelled on the planned topic. They were reliving how a young woman's steadfast faith and keen mind had shredded their professor's legacy. As the class wound down, the usual rustle of packing was laced with fervent whispers. Clusters formed, buzzing over what they'd seen. Did you catch how no one's ever faced him down like that. She stayed so cool while he just... Kale mumbled a dismissal, his typical bold wrap-up reduced to, we'll pick up later. His hands jittered as he collected his things, avoiding all eyes. A few students who'd once chuckled at his faith-bashing quips lingered by the exit, watching their once formidable professor shrink behind his stand. The titan who'd ruled this space for years stood exposed as far less. Karoline, a voice called as she neared the door. That was unreal. Others agreed, some clapping. She offered polite thanks, never gloating over Kale's fall. Thompson approached Kale, still rooted at the podium. Tavern, he murmured, this could be a chance to rethink some things. Kale nodded faintly, staring at Karoline's vacated seat, a silent rebuke to all he'd held true about faith, smarts, and his own prowess. The issue wasn't if he'd adjust his teaching, it was how much of his perspective would endure this crushing blow. That afternoon, as the conference wrapped, Kale sat alone in the empty hall, gazing at his notes. 3 decades of deriding faith now mere scrawls, undone by a young woman's resolute belief. "Professor," Karoline said, pausing before leaving. Cale looked up, his pride swapped for something raw. "Regard. In all my years," he said softly, "no one's ever forced me to face my own arrogance like you did today." Karoline gave a gentle smile. "Sometimes, the best case for faith comes from those who try to tear it down." Cale nodded slowly. "Perhaps," he said, "the real closed minds aren't the ones holding faith, but the ones laughing at it." That day echoed through academic lore, not just as when Karoline Leavitt upheld her beliefs with stunning clarity, but as evidence that truth outshines arrogance every time. Footage from that hall has spread across America's top campuses, a reminder that faith and intellect don't clash. They fuel the quest for understanding. If this tale moved you, hit like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.